Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have the forum, Challenges and Opportunities in Risk-Taking in Energy Investments. And in the panel, we have Mr. Nomi Ahmad. He is the Chief Operating Officer of Lanco Power International, Singapore. Mr. Punet Munjal is Senior General Manager, Corporate Communication Strategy and Power Management, Tata NDPL Delhi. And we have Daniel Dexter from China Light and Power, CLP. May I request each of the panelists, starting from Mr. Nomi Ahmad, to give their introduction.
Thank you very much, Pawan. I think Arun Sen, our CEO, gave a very good introduction on Lanco Power International, so I'll spare that. Within LPI, as COO, currently our projects are in the development phase, so I'm looking after the development activities. And when they go into operation, the role will slightly change.
Good morning. I work for Tata Power Delhi Distribution, which distributes power in 1/3 of Delhi, which is the national capital of India. And this is probably the first or the second privatization of the distribution sector which has happened in India, with being probably the only success which you see in India so far as distribution goes. We are a joint venture of the government of Delhi and the Tata Power Company Limited, with Tata Power holding 51% and management control. We supply power to around 1.3 million consumers spread over 200 square miles, with a peak load of around 1700 megawatt. And the system losses have been brought down. We took over the business in 2002 when the losses were somewhere around 53%, and they're currently somewhere around 11%. Thank you.
My name is Daniel Dexter. I work for CLP Group, but for the CLP India subsidiary. So I work in India, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer there. I'm also the CIO and Technical Director.
This panel which we have today has, we have the panelists who have, in fact, very good regional experience, and they have also had, in fact, pan-regional experience. And we have Mr. Punet Munjal, who has been with Tata NDPL, and Tata NDPL is a very good model of not only of a public-private partnership, but also of how, on the distribution side, privatization can lead to benefits to all stakeholders. So based on this backdrop, we have, risk-taking energy investment as the topic says. Now, in fact, we say that why do we have to handle risk? Because if you can't handle risk, you can't get capital. So as we say that capital is a coward and it goes to a place where there's no risk. But ideally, that does not exist. We can only mitigate the risk. We cannot eliminate the risk. Now, on the energy sector, in fact, the issue is who takes the risk? The lender takes the risk, the developer takes the risk, or ultimately the ultimate buyer, whosoever is there, the utility or distribution company, they have to take the risk. So these are some of the issues which need to be addressed, and every stakeholder has a different viewpoint. And let me start with Mr. Nomi Ahmad, because he has worked as a stakeholder, and he has been a banker as well as he is now also a developer. So his view on risk allocation.
Well, at the end of the day, it's the end user which ends up bearing the risk, right? Because as a typical IPP developer, we are part of the vertically integrated model. Again, as we discussed in the previous section, there are in Asia very different markets. There are markets which are vertically integrated. The classic IPP falls within that integrated market. You've got markets like the Philippines, which are fully liberal, where you are a generator bidding kilowatt hour prices into a pool. As an IPP, we look at a project during the development phase. We bid. We take a series of assumptions. We say, this is my EPC price, this is my financing plan. You've done the homework on a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, risk allocation. You go in with a set of assumptions, you put your bid in or you negotiate your tariff. Then you try to hold that all together as you get through to financial close. Hopefully at financial close, all your assumptions are still holding true and you get a proper risk allocation on the project financed. During construction, it's just getting the baby born, right? At the end of it, when you get your total project cost realized, are you still maintaining all your project assumptions? And then over the operating period, in case of a classic PPA, end of the PPA term, plants operate, equipment works, turbines work, BTGs work. Ultimately, the question comes down, can I get fuel? And can I get paid for it? So if you ask who, there is ultimately a risk allocation amongst all the counterparties, but the price risk at the end is taken by the end user. So that's where, I guess, Tata Power comes in.
Puneet, in fact, since you have been you have not been exactly the end user, but you are the one who has been in touch with the end user. Your views on, who takes the risk? The end user take the risk, and also what is also happening is that some of the Asian markets we are opening to open access. So when you have open access, well, you have a single buyer model, it's very easy to allocate the risk, but where you have multiple buyers, how do you allocate the risk to multiple buyers? And also, along with that, you may like to answer that in a, where you have multiple buyer model, can you have a very sustainable kind of an, business for the energy markets?
Sure. Well, Nomi talked about, the risk being passed on to the end consumer. And the end consumer, in our case, of course, will be the retail consumer. But largely, we've been seeing that, there's been a huge amount of pressure on tariffs, and it's not really been possible for the distribution utilities to pass on the full costs to the consumers, because the end user tariffs are largely regulated. And of course, you do have open access, you do have competition where for a high-end consumers, you could very well enter into bilateral contracts, but largely for, even in a mature market like Singapore for that matter, around 60% would be regulated, I guess.
Well, it's dropping.
Yeah, it's dropping, it's dropping. To that extent, we've not been able to pass on, the increase in fuel prices, increase in the cost of the generation utilities onto the consumers. And we, in India for that matter, we're sitting on losses. I'm talking about, let's say, Tata Power Delhi Distribution, which is supposed to be one of the, success stories so far as distribution goes. We are sitting on a receivable of $1 billion, which is equivalent to our 1-year sale. And so the risk doesn't, as of now, is not really getting passed on to the end user, where eventually it needs to reside. And it currently stays with the distribution utility, making the entire, sector unviable to that extent, because this is where this is the money end of the value chain. And in case this risk is you're not able to pass on this risk to the consumer, the end consumer, then the entire value chain becomes unviable to that extent. And taking your second question on, the multi-buyer model, sure, to de-risk, the generation, it is critical that multi-buyer model is put in place. And we in India see, we are moving in that direction, but there are a huge number of regulatory risks you have, or regulatory issues, let me put it that way. And even the governments which are not really allowing, the provincial governments which are not allowing third-party sales to that extent. And but it is critical to for you to de-risk the business to ensure that third-party sales or open access is the way forward. Sure.
Daniel, you have been operating your units in various markets in Asia. You have a very good experience of, and in fact, you have faced a lot of risks or real challenges on the ground related to the investments as an IPP in fact, in many of the markets, you have been first mover. So your views on the risk allocation.
Yeah, from an operating standpoint, I'll just say the common theme is fuel. We've heard it all morning. I think the way we try to mitigate our fuel risk is to diversify the portfolio. This has been proven around the world and for many, many years in the utility industry. If you rely on any one fuel, you can get yourself into trouble. Secondly, there's been a lot of talk about importing of fuels, be it gas or coal. We've built projects in my previous life where we were dependent. We built pipeline, for example, from Argentina to Chile. They had a surplus of gas. You invest a lot of money in a pipeline, then you build a power plant. Pretty soon Argentina shuts the valve off and you're stranded. So any country or any strategy, when we're talking about challenges and opportunities and risk-taking in energy investments, you have to consider the fuel risk and how you can mitigate that and what your backup plan is. For us in CLP India, again, we've got a balanced portfolio between gas, coal, and wind. Fortunately, we don't worry about wind fuel supply. That seems to be fairly consistent. But coal, as everybody knows in India, is spotty. We built a power station, a coal power station that can burn quite a wide range of fuel. When you design a plant to burn low calorific value coal, you usually get a very big boiler. So we've been able to show that we can burn higher gross calorific value imported fuel, up to 40 or 50%. So that gives us some options there. And again, with the PPAs that we have in place, primarily the fuel cost is a pass-through to the off-taker we sell as wholesale power. Gas is the same situation. Gas in India is low, but our PPA protects us because the fuel is a pass-through, so as long as we have 100% availability, we've kept our risk profile manageable by the PPA. We get paid for capacity even though the gas that we may have available is spot LNG at $20, $22 a million BTU. So that's how operationally we've done it within CLP India. Obviously our Australian subsidiary, our Chinese subsidiary, and even the Hong Kong base utility all face different risks.
Nomi, it appears that fuel is now becoming one of the major risks which is going to bother both the developer and the operator in future, particularly the Asia region. And one way to handle the fuel risk, of course, the renewable space, which of course, as Dexter pointed out, that for example in wind energy there's no fuel risk. But then renewable energy, there are issues of scalability because we have to reach that level. And in fact, Asian region by and large is growing at a very high rate, and the demand for energy is going to be there. So how do we balance the fuel risk and at the same time see that we don't become too much dependent on a particular type of fuel? And I mean, going forward, where do you see renewable occupying a space in the energy growth?
Well, I think as Dexter said, at the end of the day, to be sustainable, you need to look at a portfolio of different generation choices and different fuels. That's more so done on a utility level. For IPPs, and I'll first address ways to mitigate fuel. Look, at the end of the day, whether it's a single buyer model or whether it's a merchant model, as Arun Sen previously also said, all power plants effectively operate in a merchant mode. As long as you are the lowest cost producer and you're able to dispatch well below wholesale prices so it's affordable, you'll be fine. Now, the challenge of responsible development, and I go back to the old school project development where unless you satisfied your lenders that fuel was available and was available long term, you were not going to get debt finance for your project. And in many markets, working particularly with the multilaterals, that's still very much the case. Regardless of the fact that a government, a host country, may give you a gas supply agreement, which is backed by a sovereign guarantee, we will still go ahead and conduct extensive studies and make sure that we are comfortable that over the term of the PPA, gas will flow and how we will then stack up within that gas flow. If you're looking at coal, it doesn't matter if you've got a supply contract will have to go and look at the fundamentals to see, are their mines, are they operating sustainably, and will they be there in the long term? So that's responsible development. I don't think the world's changed all that much since when this industry started. There are cases, markets, take India for example, where everybody took views and proper due diligence and proper risk allocation and proper homework wasn't done. And that's why we've ended up in situations where RICS plants, CLP's plants are not getting coal. That should not happen if proper risk allocation and homework is done. With regards to renewables, look, at the end of the day, what Asia needs is reliable baseload power. And that will continue to come from thermal sources. Coal and gas will continue to dominate. Renewables, to the extent feed-in tariffs, to the extent you've got the resource, those are great, but they will always continue to be around the fringe. They will never form the basis of baseload generation, which is going to drive the Asian economies. That's just my view.
Yeah, Dexter, your views as to how to mitigate the fuel risk. How to mitigate the fuel risk? Fuel risk. Risk, yeah.
Well, again, we've got the projects that we bid on, our coal plant that we just built and commissioned last year. It's called a linkage plant. So we have linkage fuel supply agreement with Coal India to provide enough fuel for us to achieve 80% PLF, basically. Now, we all know that in India, Coal India is not producing that. So what's our risk mitigation? Again, I mentioned our boiler design allows us to burn imported fuel. With the supercritical technology we picked, our fallback is imported fuel. Even with imported fuel, burning, let's say, 50-50 or 60-40, domestic 60%, 40% imported coal, our cost of production is still low, and the lowest in the state where we have our PPA. So it's still economically viable, as you pointed out. We're the lowest cost producer, even burning imported coal. Now again, CLP always takes a long-term strategic outlook. We know that the coal supply in India will improve over time. So over the next 3 to 4 years, we will see improvements in the mining operations there and probably an increase in the fuel supply where Coal India will be able to meet its obligations, and then we can back off using imported coal. But burning imported coal, we've already seen we can still produce power at the lowest cost in the state where we have our primary PPA. There's actually 2 PPAs because my colleague here shares some of that from Tata. So that's how we've managed the risk. At our gas-based plant, again, there's a shortage of gas in India, but with our PPA that we have in place, the primary component of revenue is through the capacity payment. So as long as we have gas, whether it's high-priced gas or low-priced gas, spot LNG or wherever it comes from, we can declare 100% availability and declare our capacity payment. So our fuel risk is quite minimal.
Puneet, your views on buying power through through a PPA route, and because you are operating in a market where you have both the PPA model and you also have a merchant power model. So your views as to would you like to since you are a power purchaser, what is your view as to whether you would like to mitigate your risk by having long-term PPAs, or you would like to keep some portion of your power purchase open and buy from spot purchase market? What is your view on that?
Currently, we have around 97% of our total requirement tied up through long-term PPAs, which in my view is huge. It puts inordinate amount of pressure on tariffs, because then you're bound by the terms of the PPA. Dexter just talked about payments being made on capacity basis, which what happens is, especially in gas, where gas is available at $20, but will never get dispatched. So to that extent, I'm still obliged to make the capacity payment without getting any units in lieu of that. And so that puts a huge amount of pressure, and that is why the tariffs in Delhi, in India, have been rising to a very large extent, because most of the power is basically contracted on long-term PPA basis. So going forward, actually we are looking at getting out of some of these PPAs actually, because they're becoming unviable, some of them. Because of the fuel risk and the associated risks which are there. And we will need to move in a direction where you'll need to have maybe 40 to 50% or 60% tied through long-term PPAs, and you'd like to go merchant for the balance. Sure.
On the regulatory environment, because in Asian market we have some of the markets are absolutely deregulated or re-regulated, as has been told. Some markets the regulatory evolution is taking place. So do we have a model in place, Nomi, that this is an ideal model which can be maybe put across Asia, that this is an optimum model for regulation, so that the risk for the developer as well as the utility making the power purchase is optimized?
Well, I think Asia is so, the answer is no. Because you've got many different markets working in many different models. And let's look at a couple of extremes. And regulation and government intervention plays a huge role in all of this. The traditional vertical monopoly model, where the traditional IPPs fit in, is you've got a monopolistic position. IPP is selling capacity and energy. Single government-owned utility takes all manner of risks. They're supposed to take the fuel risk, they're supposed to take the FX risk, and ultimately whether they pass the cost on to the ratepayer or not, or they live within subsidies, but that's a single vertical buy model. You've got the other extreme, you've got markets like the OECD, Asian markets, you've got Philippines as well, which are, over time, they have liberalized. And in certain markets, 100% may be contestable. But what's happened there is that the fundamental difference between the former and the latter is that in the latter markets, the entire cost of generation, transmission, and distribution is transparently passed on to the end user, to the market. So it's what I call in a cost plus plus scenario across the whole chain. So the generation can compete, make a decent return. Transmission can compete, make a decent return. Distribution can compete, make a decent return. Yet there are price signals when demand is required. Everybody can add capacity and yet make a decent return. But take then the example where you, like take India for example, where you haven't liberalized the rates of distribution companies are still set by the state governments. So you've got one end of the chain which is locked, and you're trying to free up the other end of the chain. Someone's going to get squeezed in between. It doesn't work. So when a certain level of, and it's a political regulatory issue, when prices reflect the true cost of power, you can start thinking about introducing competition and liberalization. And unless you're there, you're headed for a disaster, as we've seen in several countries.
I couldn't agree more, Nomi, because as you rightly said, it's the price which should drive the market. May I open the question answer to the audience? Any question answers?
If you please, in accordance with your marketing experience, what are there an evaluation for the advanced technology to mitigate or squeeze the burning fuel risk?
Well, at the power plant level, to mitigate risk, that's a whole different thing than what we're talking about up here, which was more strategic in nature. But obviously, at a power plant level, there's many, many things that we have to do. I have my teams looking at spare parts, probabilities of multiple failures, system checks, backup plans for outages. For example, a lot of our coal plant kit came from China. So our team, after commissioning, immediately began looking for other sources of materials and supplies for pumps, valves, fittings, whatever, within India, because it's much more cost effective. And what we did was we built up in our project budget enough spare parts from China where we could operate the plant, we felt, very safely for about 3 years. So that was built into our investment model. Again, that was more of a strategic decision. So now we've got 2 or 3 years to look at different ways to find other sources of materials, parts, services to make sure that we can maintain the plant in a very, very reliable fashion. So that's just one example at a plant level where we're working on improving risk, the risk profile.
In fact, I would sum up that, the crux of, risk allocation, best way to risk management is to, it has been pointed out by the panelists, is that you have to be cost competitive. And that is the only way to sustain yourself. As long as you're cost competitive, you would be able to mitigate all risks. Also, in fact, there is no single model, regulatory model, which can be applied across, but there are lessons to be learned from many of the experiences which have happened. And what it also appears is that even, long-term power purchase agreement is not the solution to, all the problems of requirement of energy requirements, as it's been pointed out. And of course, it's also not appropriate to burden your project developer with all the risk, because probably project developer would be more comfortable as long as he's meeting the operating efficiency and performance parameters. So in fact, it would be best to leave the residuary risk to the project developer and the operator. But also, it's also important that, the risk allocations are very clearly identified, because once the risk allocation is identified, the financiers, both debt and equity, you give them a lot of comfort. And that's how the, financial closures will have to have. Ultimately, the taste of putting lies in eating. So ultimately, if you are able to attract capital, that's the answer to your ability to have been, you have been able to answer the risk mitigations. Thank you very much.